Coombe, Part 10. Coombe awoke to a hard backhanded slap across his face, and another and another. Coombe couldn't help but notice they felt a little wet as he tasted blood in his mouth. He opened his eyes, lifted his head and took in his surroundings. He was in a dark cellar, sure, but the snooker table off to his left was an interesting design choice. Coombe loved the snooker and gave himself the pleasure of wistfully thinking back to the Taylor-Davis final all those years ago. The walls were wet and hung with some sort of brown lichen crawling down its facade from the vaulted ceiling that made the room feel less of a cellar and more like a morgue. Coombe was tied to a chair, Edwardian mahogany if he wasn't mistaken, for Coombe loved wood. His legs were bound, as were his hands, and curiously his fingers were splayed and tied down individually. Somewhere in the gloom a voice spoke. "Mr. Coombe, welcome to my little den of iniquity." "It's just Coombe, and if you think you'll get any information out of me, you, sir, are sorely mistaken." "Ah, but Mr. Coombe, I know why you're here and who you're investigating. I merely want to have my wicked way with you." Coombe felt a cold shiver pass down his spine. Ah, a pervert, he thought. He'd met plenty of those in his time, the kind of men unloved by their fathers and struck one too many times by their ardent mothers. Coombe had never broken before and wouldn't give his captor the pleasure this time. "A simple hypodermic needle, Mr. Coombe, used by millions every day to administer life-saving and life-giving medications. I shall start by inserting them into the end of your fingertips, each containing a cluster of nerve endings that will spark delightfully at every insertion." The disembodied voice gave way to a slight man stepping out of the shadows, a sickly-looking man with a mournful pallor and thin lips. He looked, Coombe thought, like the corpse of James Stewart warmed up to barely room temperature. He rested his hand gently upon Coombe's and slid a needle into the end of his index finger. The pain was exquisite and all-encompassing as he inserted a second and a third. Coombe held his breath and showed no sign of the pain he was feeling. "Ah, it seems to have had little effect on you, Mr. Coombe. Very well. I shall proceed to place the needle under your fingernail and push gently, but oh so pervasively, until I get a reaction out of you. You see, that's all I'm after. I want to find your limit and push it." This time Coombe felt the air being sucked out of him and sickening feeling in his gut as his captor pushed the needle under his nail. Suddenly, a door opened into the darkness, and raising his head, Coombe could make out the figure of a man in the doorway. "I told you I was not to be disturbed when in my pleasure palace." The figure in the doorway raised a hand clutching something and brought it down sharply on the head of Coombe's torturer. He slumped to the ground, head hitting the wall as he went. The figure stepped out of the shadows. Prakash? Coombe will return in Coombe Part 11. No Time to Die.